Oh yeah, recording, which our wise colleague, Dr. James Anderson here has started, 2 years ago, and has gone very well indeed. It examines the pending issues and problems of our day in a historical, cultural, political, and social context through an interdisciplinary approach. And the topic for today is certainly a timely one: Europe in crisis, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in perspective. Today's presentation is brought to you by the UNCG History Department, UNCG's Russian Studies Program, the International Global Studies Program, and HNEC, the Humanities Network and Consortium. My name is Jeff Jones. I'm a member of the History Department, and I'll be moderating today's event with a star-studded group of panelists who will present in this order, starting with Dr. William Crowther in the Political Science Department, Dr. Kathleen Macfie in the Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department, also director of the IGS program, Dr. Sarah Krive, also in LLC, and Dr. Kevin Reese, who is also in the LLC department. We've asked our presenters to keep their opening remarks and comments relatively brief so that we can have a lively Q&A and discussion afterward following the event, and we wrap everything up promptly at 1 o'clock. We are not going to use the chat function though, so if you do have questions afterwards, and hopefully comments or questions, many of you will, we ask that you turn your cameras on and raise your hands either literally or physically or virtually, and we'll call on folks as in order and do it that way. So let me turn it over to Dr. Crowther, please, Bill. It's all yours.
Okay, so I guess the first question is, what is going on here? And the answer is, I have no idea. And I wouldn't believe anybody that told me that they did know exactly why this was happening or what's happening. The buildup's been going on for, on to 2 months now. It comes in conjunction with a set of demands that the Russian government is making on the United States and NATO. Those are demands. And this is the odd things, the demands that they were making are things that they had to know from the very beginning could not be met, would not be met, will not be met. So that has to mean either that the demands are a casus belli, that they're simply waiting for us to say no so they can initiate a conflict, or that they want to use it as leverage for other kinds of concessions. Or it could be that they're using the military buildup to divide the United States from Europe and various NATO allies from each other, because allies have different interests with respect to Russia. Initially, this did not look so bad. With the first phase of the buildup, they were pre-positioning armor, air defense systems, things like that. But then more recently, in the last 4 weeks, they've been moving troops to the front to catch up with the armor they already have there. And unfortunately, in the last 4 or 5 days, they've been moving up logistics services and field hospitals, all of which looks like they're actually getting ready to fight. I mean, so it's looking more and more like this isn't just building up pressure, that they're preparing for some kind of an incursion. If they decide to do something, they can clearly win. I mean, there's no question about that. Their military is about armed services altogether is something under 1 million people. The Ukrainians' military is something around 250,000. That sounds bad enough, but if you look at any of the things that really count in modern military conflicts, I'm not going to go through a bunch of numbers, but in just about every category, aircraft, fighter aircraft, Navy, artillery, tanks, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by like more than 10 to 1. So they can just swamp Ukraine if they decide to do that. Now, the thing that doesn't make a lot of sense to me here, really, regarding why would they be doing this, is that it's one thing to invade Ukraine, but the consequences after you win are sort of like us in Iraq. not going to be so good for them. That Kiev has a population of close to 3 million people. Trying to occupy that for a long period of time against the population's will is going to be messy. And in addition to their regular military, the Ukrainians have, close to 1 million people in territorial defense units that they've been busily arming should it come to having to fight a long-term war against the Russians. So the cost of this for Putin would be high. Why could he be doing it? I really don't understand, because it is going to be really, in terms of human casualties, a nasty fight if they decide to do it. Even if he stands off and uses, air attacks and things like that to degrade the Ukrainian forces, Russian people, I think, are not going to be particularly thrilled at pictures coming back of fellow Slavs, and in a lot of cases, Russian people in Ukraine dying in attacks on civilian targets. So, who knows? I mean, there's people talk a lot about invading, taking Ukraine, which I rather doubt, but he could have more limited intentions here, which would be either to occupy militarily and annex Donetsk and Luhansk, the two breakaway republics, or he could be planning to move up to the Dnieper River and just occupy all of Eastern Ukraine, which is both Russian ethnic and Russophone population is concentrated there, and probably would be less hostile to Russian occupation. So, I mean, that's the sort of broad picture of what's happening. Where it's all going to go, it's just impossible to tell.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for getting us off to an excellent start. And Kathleen, we'll turn it over to you for your observation.
Thank you. Mine is a little different approach, or a little different perspective. I'd like to share some observations from the Ukrainian side, right, about actions that Ukraine has taken in the last 30 years to kind of consolidate and present a national, cultural, and linguistic identity that's distinct from Russia. And the time frame for this 30-year period isn't surprising or unique, and the actions themselves are not surprising or unique. I think would find similar activity to reframe identity if we looked, across the former Soviet Union. But Ukraine somehow feels different. And Ukraine and Russia do share an organic and deeply intertwined existence. Ukraine is the place that we point to, right, for the beginning of Rus, right? So at some point, this is a common starting point. And for many of us in the West, I feel that Ukraine has just been seen as an extension of Russia, right? Some sort of unfolding of Russianness across this territory. I mean, how recently did we stop saying the Ukraine, right? Or as an acknowledgement that this was a sovereign nation? Or where are we still in shifting from saying Kiev to Kyiv, right? I find myself still in that bind. I do believe that this sort of stubborn association of the two of them as intertwined is part of what's behind maybe a lack of interest or lack of outrage over Russia's threatening actions in the recent past. And this intertwinedness does make Ukraine different from, say, Estonia or Georgia. When I first toured the Soviet Union in 1987, I studied abroad, and we toured several other Soviet republics. The Soviet imprint was there in Georgia and Estonia, but it felt just like that, like something overlaid and imposed over an existing identity. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the gain of independence, much of what was Soviet or Russian in these areas simply coexisted or fell away. But in Ukraine, to an outsider, the language was not so front and center, not so different. And when I was there in 1987, Ukraine felt like Russia, right? It felt like all similar, part and parcel. And for many of us who have come to study this region from an investment or a study of Russian first, we may have Russian language skills. We may not have Georgian, I bet, or Estonian, definitely, right? Or Ukrainian. We learn to at least maybe not lead with Russian when we're working in these regions. But it's this sense of intertwined history that I think has made so visible this concerted effort to become distinct, to show a distinct and separate identity. My observations here are made through the lens of my own experience working in Ukraine on a project that started 10 years ago when I visited the Bulgakov Museum in Kyiv, and I became fascinated with how it compares, how it contrasts to the presentation of Bulgakov in the museum to him in Moscow. And I started thinking about the role of museums as public space, as ritual space, and as a forum for the shifting or construction of identity. I returned to Ukraine in 2015 after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, and I was back working in the archives in the museum in February and March of 2020. And in 2015, things were still understandably fresh. There was a lot of what looked like impromptu memorials to people who had died at the Maidan. They felt collective, but it also felt like it emanated from the private side of society. And there was an urgency to share information, to uncover the sort of truth of what Russia's role had been, actions of Russia in both the events at Maidan and the takeover of Crimea. But in 2020, things felt very, very different. This sense of Ukrainianness felt palpable and unavoidable and charged with a tone of protest, right? That this attitude of we're going to enforce this, this concerted display of Ukrainianness made me look afresh at the period since Ukraine established independence 30 years ago. And some of the actions that are not surprising certainly predate the conflicts that maybe we point to starting in 2013, 2014. Beginning with even the name of the location of this 2014 revolution, right? The Maidan Nezalezhnosti represents a shaking off not only of a Soviet past, but the Russian name associated that, right? Ploshchad, which means square. Both of them mean square, right? Maidan in Ukrainian, Ploshchad in Russian, and the Russian form showed up in a number of iterations of the names, going back to the 1800s. We look at the currency reforms, right? Not surprising. The Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, became the sole legal tender in 1992. And in a series of currency reforms, we have now, paper currency that foregrounds these sort of touchstone figures in Ukrainian nationhood, identity, and culture, right? So these things predate these recent conflicts. There is, we look at founding of public spaces and renaming of spaces, and we could point to the Ivan Ganchor Museum that was founded in 1993 with a mission to revive national culture and ethnic identity, to preserve Ukrainian folk crafts. The Cathedral to Saint Sophia, not new, obviously. The foundation's laid in 1036, 1037. Jeff will know these facts better than I do. And of course, had been under Soviet control and returned to Ukrainian control in the 1980s, but since 2018 has been the seat of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which cut ties with the Russian Orthodox Church, right? That's a new development. So some of these things, some of the actions are not new, Some things that are new, we might point to the initiative from 2015 to shift all post-primary school education to Ukrainian. It's a complex initiative. It's not slated to be complete in its implementation until, I don't know, 2023, 24 maybe. And there are lots of stipulations about who can opt out, or provisions for ethnic minorities and for Russians. But the goal is that 80% of instruction will be Ukrainian based. But what felt new in 2020 was this sense that all aspects of society were coming at this concerted effort, right? So public, private, individual, collective, and walking through Kyiv, parks and streets and building names, monuments and religious symbols, public signage, supporting, instructional or what do you call the text that you see in parks, right? Markers, all in Ukrainian and only in Ukrainian. And this is something that was strikingly different from earlier trips to Ukraine. Entering stores, ordering in restaurants, public transportation, performances, speeches, language of instruction, all in Ukrainian. And at the Bulgakov Museum where I worked, a complete shift in gallery signage, in publications, in the language of operation, and even a sign on the front door of the museum that says, if you support the current occupation of Ukrainian territory by Russian troops, please do not come in, right? So this is a museum, a public museum. It's part of the city of Kiev's historical museum structure. It's pretty blatant statement. And so many anecdotal encounters with people my age and older, so people who were educated almost exclusively in Russian, who worked the majority of their professional lives speaking Russian, native speakers of Russian, right? Who would not speak Russian to me, who even staunchly portrayed an inability to understand or speak Russian. Even when falling back on those, on that, like, I'm an American, I'm an academic, I'm working on a project that, focuses on, exploring your culture. I happen to speak Russian. If that's the language that we share, let's use it, blank faces. And all of this sort of supports a concerted, conscious, deliberate effort to establish, to exert an identity that's distinct and separate from its Russian neighbor, and one that won't be subverted, ignored, or replaced, even if Russia takes control over more territory. I've tried to stay away from my current research, although I find it very interesting. But if there are questions later about that, those are my observations, Jeff.
Thank you, Kathleen. It is very interesting. That's fascinating. Wow. Let's turn to Sarah, Dr. Krive. You'll take the ball and run with it from here.
Yeah, thanks. So my contribution is going to bring us more into Russia, and the purpose of that being on my behalf to talk a little bit about the fact that whatever we think is going on in Putin's Russia, there is a lot more to Russian consciousness of atrocities, and there's increasing danger for journalists and for everyone. So the organization I want to talk about is Memorial, specifically the NGO International Memorial, which is related to, but separate from, the Moscow Memorial and all of the satellite or small regional memorial organizations. It's a loose coalition. So I'd like to call our attention to the very recent move to liquidate this human rights organization. And it is the Russian Federation's most esteemed human rights organization, founded by Arseniy Raginsky, who died in 2017. He founded it in 1988 after many years in the Soviet period of collecting historical documents, photographs, and publishing them abroad. There were 6 issues of a journal called Pamyat, Memory, which of course had to be published abroad in the 1970s. For that, he was imprisoned by the Soviet authorities, later rehabilitated, and I believe he served as the director of Memorial from 1998 on, even though the organization began in '88. So existing as a loose coalition of smaller regional organizations, Memorial has not only documented in archival fashion the history of Stalinist repressions, but has become a center of human rights and social activity among the intelligentsia, especially Moscow Memorial. So some of you may be aware that there's this notion of being a foreign agent, which can be anything from a spy. Typically that's a spy, right? If you want to be a foreign agent. But the law has been strengthened to include all kinds of individuals. At the end of 2020, it can apply to physical persons, to organizations. Of course, some of us are familiar with Alexei Navalny, who was imprisoned, when was it? It's a year ago, like last week, right? And he was poisoned in August of 2020. So Navalny is another example of somebody, the organizations related to whom are being labeled as foreign agents. So since being labeled as a foreign agent, International Memorial has come under increasing threat, and in December 2021 was declared defunct. So, and there's been an uproar about that. So most recently, the European Union's High Representative Josep Borrell and a joint statement on court decisions by Americans and others, members of the EU, they've stated, and I want to just read some of what they say. They quote, deplore the decisions by 2 Russian courts to forcibly close International Memorial and the Memorial Human Rights Center. For more than 3 decades, Memorial has fulfilled a unique role in documenting historical crimes and recovering for posterity the memory of the tens of millions of victims of political repression in the country. Memorial has also advocated tirelessly for the protection of human rights in Russia, exposing appalling abuses, including in the North Caucasus, and maintaining a growing list of individuals it considers to be political prisoners. And I might just note today that just yesterday or something, Belarus now counts 1,000 political prisoners in Belarus. That's the number that is being identified in Belarus. So and back to this text, the claim by Russian authorities that Memorial Human Rights Center's principled and peaceful work, quote, justifies extremism and terrorism, end quote, cannot be accepted. Memorial's work has never been more needed. The unconscionable decision to silence Memorial follows many months of deepening and systematic repression in Russia against human rights defenders, independent media and journalists, political opposition members and critical voices, as well as religious minority groups and other marginalized groups. And we could unpack in another whole hour all of those groups and how people are being targeted and disappeared. And a recent blog post by Sergei Parkhomenko for the Kennan Institute makes a really interesting point about Memorial. And I invite you to, I have all sorts of sources, you could go read more about this. But one of the, aside from the notion that Putin wants to recast Stalinist atrocities, it's not that in a better light, whatever, but it's to keep control of the narrative. And so one of the main threats posed by Memorial is its physical archive. The pure materiality and physicality of these letters, photographs, prison ledgers, everything that there is. The notion that you can fake any kind of document in a virtual space, but the actual physical documents retain their power. So they provide this irrepressible proof of the past and the present, and they threaten Putin's attempts to recast the Russian state narrative about not only Soviet era human rights abuses, but those of his own regime. So my main point being that whatever is going on externally, however Putin's focusing things externally, internally, the dangers have increased exponentially, and I think we should be aware of that. Next.
Thank you, Sarah. That's awesome. Thank you very much. Kevin, turn it over to you, sir.
Everyone. So I wanted to talk also from sort of an inside Russia perspective. I'm thinking about how in Russian public life, there's a kind of assumption of common engagement with a literary tradition that we don't have in America. And so Putin kind of oddly has multiple times expressed a liking for Gogol, which seems like he hasn't read him. And there's this notion that Russian leaders have always paid attention to writers. They keep tabs on them. Pushkin, of course, as many of us know, was personally censored by Nikolai I. He was exiled numerous times for politically questionable verses. And then there's the observation that poets in particular have this prophetic role as speakers of truth. And I wanted to, this had me thinking in particular about Mandelstam, who died in 1938, a poet connected with the Acmeists. And, another Acmeist, Gumilyov, was the first major artist to be killed by the Bolsheviks. And the thing I'm thinking about is what Mandelstam said famously to his wife about how we can tell how much the Russian leadership values poetry. And I'll read it first in Russian, it's really short. «Чего ты жалуешься? Поэзию уважают только у нас. За нее убивают. Ведь больше нигде за поэзию не убивают». So he says, why are you complaining? They only respect poetry in our country. They kill you for it. We're the only place in the world where they kill you for poetry. And Mandelstam's Stalin epigram that he famously wrote in 1933 that, and I have a copy of that if anyone, in English and Russian, if anyone wants to read it, that resulted in his arrest and internal exile to Voronezh. And then he was later rearrested in the Great Purge and died of typhoid fever in a transit camp near Vladivostok. And, these stories are countless about writers and poets. But, his body wasn't buried in a common grave the following spring. And I'm thinking about Mandelstam because art is still being monitored, right? It's still valued and we know it's being valued because artists are being monitored in today's Russia. Russia remains among the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist. There was the Pussy Riot punk prayer in 2012 that resulted in the arrest and prison time for Nadezhda Tolokolnikova and Maria Alyokhina, who are still involved at putting themselves in great danger in protests now. And Dr. Krive brought this to my attention yesterday, that this week, the feminist poet and artist Daria Sirenko was arrested at a book signing in Moscow, and she was kept overnight in a prison cell and sentenced to 15 days in prison. Her crime was that she had posted to Twitter a red exclamation point, which is a symbol of support for Navalny. And actually a couple of other people were arrested for that same crime. And Sirenko herself was this time last year, she was the organizer of a Valentine's Day protest in support of women in jail who were regarded as political prisoners. And after this protest, Sirenko was doxxed. Her personal data and physical address of some of her relatives were posted by this person, I'll say Vladislav Bliznikov, who's a leader in the Muzhskoye Gosudarstvo, the men's state movement. It's a flamboyantly anti-LGBT, anti-feminist men's rights organization in Russia that's really popular, or was really popular, I think, on VKontakte. It was removed a bit, I understand. And so I just wanted to point out that poetry continues to be a medium of protest, and poets and writers and artists continue to be suppressed. And so we had just a few years, at the end of the Soviet, sort of in the 80s and 90s, and, in the sort of Putin 1 period, when poets could feel relatively free, but they do not now. So that's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, very much. All right, so now we'll take any questions folks may have. We ask that you, if possible, if it's working, turn your cameras on, and you can raise your hands physically and or virtually. We'll try to get as many questions in the half hour that we have left. Someone want to get us get the ball rolling here? No, we've said all there is to say.
I know I've got some students out there.
Yeah, here's a hand. Alec Wrestler, can you turn your camera on by any chance, or certainly at least unmute and give us your question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess my question, my impression of the conflict in 2014 was that it was a lot more low intensity, and that there weren't like these big logistic kind of movements, and also with regard to the like the armored units. And I'm curious if anybody or any of you have any insight onto how you think that the conflict would go this time, because also I know that it tended to stay out of heavily populated areas, and so I'm curious about that.
So in Crimea, they had a population that was largely Russian. The area is largely a Russian area, and Russian people see it as being Russian as well. Before the conflict started, they infiltrated relatively large numbers of special forces people, and they had the support of the local population. So they didn't need to do anything dramatic at all in the case of Crimea. This is not going to be that. The Ukrainian military is much better prepared to do this, that is, defend Ukraine now, than they were in the Crimean conflict. They've had a lot more training. They're much better equipped. And I think they're much more committed to defend these areas. So if this does turn into be a conflict, it will be a very different conflict than Crimea. I think it's a different model.
Marcus Harrington, right?
Yes. I guess sort of a follow-up question. Do you believe the Ukraine will try to ask for assistance in defending itself from Russia if there is an attack, hypothetically?
They've already asked for assistance. Didn't get any.
Okay, I'm not very familiar with it. I guess I'm just kind of asking, do you think it will sort of blow up into a worldwide crisis, similar to something like World War I?
Right. No, I don't think so. I think I hope not. Everybody is signaling that it's not going to. The NATO members, all of them, including the United States, have made it clear that Ukraine is not a NATO member, and we have no treaty commitment to defend them, and that we will not deploy troops to Ukraine. So that shouldn't happen. The problem with this stuff is that there are always unintended consequences when militaries start operating at very high levels of mobilization and close to each other. You can get a conflict even when you didn't intend to or want one. Does that make sense? In terms, and in terms of global crisis, if they invade, like really invade, like try to occupy all of Ukraine, there will be a global crisis, but not necessarily a global military crisis. But I think, for example, the estimation is that oil prices will go up to $120 a barrel, disrupt the flow of natural gas into Europe. Germany's 50% dependent on natural gas from Russia, and you can't really replace that very well with LNG from the United States or from the Middle East. So it will turn into at least a financial crisis, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Do any of the other panelists, by the way, want to chime in? I know there's several other hands up, but actually I can't see everybody now.
Yeah, I can't either.
Yeah, okay. Other panelists, I see you now. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you, Bill. We've got, again, as noted, several other hands. I think Beck Rock River. I hope I'm pronouncing that reasonably well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good afternoon, all. I just was having a question about the price to mobilize such a large force. I can't remember exactly what number I heard for the amount of troops that have been mobilized on the Russian-Ukraine border, but I heard that Russia's mobilized something like 900,000, some in that area.
No, it's more like
No,
120,000.
120,000? Okay,
Between
well, I
100
don't know
and
where I read that
120,000,
one.
what I've heard, Bill.
But regardless of whatever number it is, it's certainly expensive to mobilize that number of troops. Certainly expensive, and
that's true.
And it's probably taken some sort of economic toll on Russia if it's being done long term. And Ukraine certainly isn't happy with the situation economically. If I was an investor, I would not invest in a candy factory in Ukraine right now. Certainly not. So I can't imagine that there's much economic development going on. And I was wondering what y'all thought about how long this can go on without leading to some sort of conflict or demobilization. How long can they stay on the border, do y'all think, without doing something?
So that's a good question. It can't go on for that long. I don't think that they can. I mean, that's why people are concerned right at this very moment. And it's why President Biden has said yesterday that all American citizens should leave Ukraine, and they should leave now. So the earlier mobilization of just moving armor and air defense towards the border, they could keep that there forever, right? They're just parked in big tank parks and things like that. But as they've moved the troops in too, those are like all guys, they're all living in tents, it's cold. So they can't keep them there for long. So they're moving towards this point of maximum preparedness for war, like right now. From what, analysts of this say, what our intelligence community says, what the military says, there's a window of maybe 3 more weeks during which they can move the kind of stuff that they have, after which everything turns into a big muddy swamp and you can't be driving tanks around in it. So I think that this period, like whatever is going to happen sometime, probably within a month anyways, on the outside. And then they'll either demobilize or they'll do it.
I heard something recently, it was just on NPR a couple of days ago, about the 20th of February as a date to look at because it's the end of the Olympics, and that Putin doesn't want to upset China right now, or doesn't want to overshadow the Olympics. Is that, and that might be a date they're looking towards.
That's interesting because, we've been through some of this before. Russia invaded Georgia on August 8th of 2008, which was the opening ceremony of the Beijing Summer Olympics at the time. But of course, things have changed since then. A good friend of mine in Atlanta called after that happened and told me that all the gun shops in Alabama had sold out because they heard that Russia had invaded Georgia. Wrong Georgia. Anyway,
let me just, I just wanted to add one more thing in terms of the expense of all this and how the economics work out. We're talking about sanctioning Russia, but ever since 2014, the Russians have been doing as much as they can to sanction-proof their economy.
Yeah.
Right now, they have saved up just about $500 billion in sovereign wealth funds. And they've shifted their trade away from the European Union and towards China. So until very recently, the EU was Russia's biggest trading partner. Now China is their biggest trading partner. Yeah. So they're doing what they can to get ready. I mean, it looks like in case the sanctions go in. Is it expensive? Yes, and it's the expense of this is why President Zelensky has been trying to play down the possibility of attacks while we've been playing it up because he's concerned that it's forcing investment out of Ukraine.
Yeah, that contrast is rather sharp. They are singing a very different tune from what the Biden administration has been, for sure. Right. And the other thing for me is that, just to throw this out there, is how much can you just impose sanctions? Like, I mean, we're at the point now where we're imposing sanctions or threatening to impose sanctions on individuals around Putin and possibly even Putin himself. But I really don't think that's going to be particularly effective, quite frankly. I agree, Bill, that they have become all but sanction proof, or they're at least striving to become so, especially stronger ties with China. Liliana Tata, and again, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that.
Yeah, hi, it's Liliana Tita.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, you're good. I was just wondering what the feel and vibe is for like the youth in both countries. Like, what are their thoughts?
Maybe one of the other panelists want to jump in on that. Kevin or Kathleen, if you guys have any insights on that.
I don't really have an insight into the youth culture in Ukraine. Unfortunately, most of my interaction and research, my colleagues are sort of
not the youth.
Not the youth. Not the youth. But I will say that, you know, in the early, this is going back, but in the early 2000s, you guys may remember we hosted two Fulbrighters from Ukraine. And it was really interesting. One of them was ethnically Ukrainian and said, like, I'm 100% Ukrainian. It's very, you know, that's very rare. But also said, you know, she had to teach herself Ukrainian watching, I don't know, cartoons or something. We shouldn't discount the impact of this shift to instruction in Ukrainian, right, in colleges and in high schools and in education. I don't know, it seems to me an important sort of reinforcement of this idea that sort of we're not like them. We're not like them. And I wanted to point out also on the troop deployment, you know, when you're saying, when we are saying that the troops can't stay amassed and living in these tents forever, you know, that the Russian military culture is very different from, you know, sort of expectations in the US, that there's not, they certainly are not coddled, right? There's certainly, you know, like the expectation, if we tell you to live in a tent for a year, you know, that's what'll happen.
So, can I answer Liliana a little bit? I can't talk about Ukraine, but very recently, young people in Russia were interviewed about Memorial and about the potential of it being closed. And it was interesting. The response was, you can't silence us. The work will go on. Like in some way, shape, or form, the work will go on. And I thought that was brave. So
I'm not sure about Ukraine. If you look at public opinion polling in Russia, the younger generation, people from 18 to 24, are supportive of Putin. I mean, that's fact. Broadly, they support Putin. But you know also got to consider that, you know, Putin's been there since 2000. This is 2022. Most of them have never been alive when there's been another president. And as they see the Russian economy, there has been significant success during that period. It's gotten dramatically better. In Ukraine, Ukraine per capita GDP is about a third of what it is in Russia. It's a relatively poor country. President Zelensky comes after a whole series of, you know, quite corrupt presidents ever since independence, and there's been a whole lot of instability there. So I think, you know, probably young people in Ukraine, like a lot of people, are very unhappy with their system of governance, not just the individuals involved. Zelensky personally, his popularity in the country when he was first elected was quite high. 2019, you know, 75%, something like that. Right now, it's running at 24% to 27% consistently since late last year. So you might get the idea if you just look at Western news reports that he's a popular guy because he's supporting Ukrainian independence. But I'll tell you, he's not at all.
Yeah. That's been sort of the common pattern, right, Bill? With they're popular when they're elected for a short. There's a honeymoon period, and then their popularity. I mean, his predecessor Poroshenko. Someone mentioned the investment in candy earlier. Was had a candy factory, right, or candy production.
People
Still does.
used to call him the Candy King, but in fact, that's sort of demeaning from my point of view, because it makes him seem like he's funny, but in fact, he was one of the
horrible
oligarchs in the country that
terribly corrupt.
Holdings all over southern Ukraine.
I don't know if I forgot who mentioned the candy part, but that was I don't know if that was a reference to him or not, but it stood out. Willington.
Could I respond to
sorry, Kevin.
Just to say that I mentioned the Pussy Riot Collective earlier. Those members are sort of now elder statesmen of protest, and they're in their early 30s. They were in their early 20s when they did that performance in the Moscow Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and so what Dr. Krive was saying, that whatever the circumstances, it will go on. It's kind of a miracle that organizations like Memorial ever existed in the first place. That work is not going to stop. It's just going to be harder.
Yeah. Excellent. Again, excellent. And the Pussy Riot, at least two of them were sentenced to fairly harsh sentences. But then again, with the tie into the Olympics, Putin graciously commuted their sentence and let them out of prison during the Sochi Olympics of 2014, as I recall.
Right. And the bravery of these women who, they get out of jail and they got right back to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Willington Camargo, you have been waiting very patiently, sir, and a student from my class, so I'm glad to see you here.
Is my mic working well?
Yeah, can hear you just fine.
Awesome. I was going to ask, I know it was being discussed earlier. It was about, I know historically, political opponents have been suppressed, but I know it's been ramped up. And now with the memorial, they were silenced, or, they're being denounced by the Russian government. What kind of implications does this have with Ukraine? Does this mean that Russia has sort of an excuse, they can control the narrative for moving into Ukraine or doing more actions towards Ukraine?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know if someone else wants to chime in on that. I'll just note briefly here that they have definitely the Russian government controls the media and therefore controls the narrative. Not much has changed since the Soviet period in that regard. And the narrative from their perspective is very, very, very different indeed. It's all about NATO expansion, and they see this as a threat from the West primarily, and the West moving NATO into its borders, and they have packaged it in a very different way from what we see. NATO is the boogeyman, has been since its formation in 1949 from the Soviet period, and even more so into the post-Soviet period in some ways, because it was a Cold War organization that many post-Soviet Russian leaders felt like should be defunct in the post-Cold War period. On the contrary, it has expanded very much into Eastern Europe, into areas including the Baltic states that used to be part of the Soviet sphere. I mentioned the conflict in Georgia earlier in 2008, and then in Ukraine now for the second time. A lot of the issues underlying those conflicts are the potential, from the Russian perspective and the Russian narrative, is the potential threat of the spread of NATO, which they see as an aggressive agenda being pushed by the West. So yes, they control the narrative, and it is a very different story from what you will hear, from the Western point of view. I don't know if that completely addresses, and I'm hoping others will.
Jeff,
yes.
Do you think, is this related? Is this related to the notion of, somebody help me out here, the soldier, what is it? The pitiful soldier narrative. It's like putting forth this notion that even though they're the aggressor, they're
the victims.
Yes, they purport to be the victims and the aggrieved in order to be the aggressor. It's a brilliant strategy.
It is, and it's tried and true. Yeah. The Russians did not invent that. Right?
Yeah, especially as relates to the Caucasus.
Right.
Never.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll come back.
And I don't know if others want to chime in. We've got about 10 minutes less than, and four more hands up. So, but did I hear someone else?
Alexander.
Anyone?
Yes, hello, can y'all hear me?
Yes, Alexander.
Right. So
yeah.
I'm curious and want to get your insight from y'all about this. What is the likelihood of Russia, Ukraine, and perhaps other member states regarding the Minsk agreements, if that's going to be going forward? Because I recall there was a meeting between President Emmanuel Macron of France and President Putin of Russia regarding this issue. So what do y'all think might happen? What do you think is the likelihood if going forward?
So the sticking point there is Ukraine. There have been several meetings since this started. Some meetings of a group of 5, really. It's the Russians, the Ukrainians, the French, and the Germans have been trying to work something out about the Minsk Accords. The Ukrainians just refused to give on this. The Accords, as they see it, were entered into by a previous regime, the government, that was much more favorably inclined towards Russia. The current government is more nationalistic, I think, as you could get from what Kathleen was saying about the changes going on in Kiev. The sticking point is that the Accords call for Ukraine to recognize the autonomy, not the independence, but the autonomy of the 2 breakaway regions within the context of Ukraine. And Ukrainian nationalists say, oh my God, if we do that, we're conceding Ukrainian territory, that it is actually Russian territory, and then Ukraine's gone. The dream of unified Ukraine is gone. So from the point of view of the Ukrainian government, they're not going to go. They want the Accords to be sort of reorganize the timetable. So first they would do the things they want to do, like giving Ukrainians back control over the border between Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and Russia, right? They want to control that border. And then they say, okay, then we can have talks about a settlement with the 2 regions. And the Russians say, no, the Accords say you guys first have to recognize their autonomy, and then we'll move towards discussion of these other issues. So it seems that the Accords are just stuck, but you never know what's going on behind the scenes as the pressure builds.
Okay, excellent. We did have 2 hands up, but I guess we just have the one. So we have about 5 minutes. William, we'll let you jump in here and round things out for us. Wrap it up.
Hi, Jeff. Yeah, thanks a lot. This has been really awesome. Let's see, I had a question about NATO, and that's the question I was going to ask. It feels like you've already discussed that. I was wondering if you or maybe others could comment on how Russians view Ukrainians. I know that Putin and others have commented in the past that they don't believe that Ukrainians constitute a legitimate ethnic identity. And I'm wondering if y'all can talk about that for a bit.
Sure. Kathleen, that's right up your alley there. I don't know if you want to.
I can't really speak about I think that yes, Will is correct. The Russian view is that Ukrainians are us, right? Yeah. But if you look at the polling in Ukraine about independence, separation from Russia, there's a high dissatisfaction with governmental activity, right? But there's a strong support for the independence holidays, for the acts of independence. So I think there is still some sort of nationalist coalescence around that issue, even if they're largely dissatisfied. I mean, I think you nailed it, that these new leaders are very popular when we bring them in, but then their inability to make changes, or they're falling into the same sort of routes of corruption, sort of make that shine not last. That's all I got.
And yeah, we do have the young woman came back, Furkan Ozdemir. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. And I think we have just enough time to squeeze that one question in, and then we will officially wrap up.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm from Europe and in a country that very close to Ukraine, and I've been to the Ukraine a lot. My question is, the Putin was saying America just overstepping the situation here and then making things manipulated over media and everything. And then they're just trying to get ready, not get ready for the war, but just being cautious. So of course we know it's not true, but I think the true part was if really America is overstepping, but with the Biden's politics, because, it's the power is power. So United States never want Russia became really powerful over Europe, but in Europe, we have also United Nations. So they will definitely support if there's something in Europe. So my concern is how it is true when it comes to perspective of Americans, because many of Americans were concerned that America, like in the Iraq war, why it's overstepping to the other side of the world. Of course, we all want peace, but, priorities. And the second one, the question is why United Nations were taking United Nations, European Union were taking steps, why now America overstepping the situation. So how do you agree with this? And then I want to learn, because what Americans want. So if you're speaking about a country, Biden in this case, you need to consider what your people thinking. So I think that's my question. Do you agree that Biden is overstepping and not really considering the needs of Americans first and just spending all that resources over Russia? And as we know, America spent a lot of money on military and guns and everything. So how do you look at this from American perspective?
Good question. Complex question. I don't know. Anyone want to jump? I mean, I will just say I do think the Biden administration has somewhat over-exaggerated things, quite frankly. And yes, you're right. The United States spends way too much, frankly, in my opinion, on military defense. Outspends the next, is it 6 or 7 countries, I think, combined in terms of military defense. We are by far the most, in terms of spending on the military, and the United States has no question overstepped in recent history many times. So there's precedence here, and believe me, the Russians are clearly aware of that, and they are playing that up as part of the narrative. Again, they see themselves as a victim in this and as playing a defensive role. That's why they have the troops on the border, is at least how they see it right now, or how they portray it right now.
So I'm not sure I really agree with that. I mean, agree that, yes, the United States has been behaving as a hegemonic power in world politics since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's part of what has President Putin upset. He's saying that he's been ignored by NATO and ignored by the United States, and there's certainly something to that. In terms of this specific conflict, I think the Biden administration has been trying to calibrate its response to avoid doing anything that's going to cause the Russians to invade. We're moving 8,000 troops into NATO countries neighboring, like Poland, neighboring Ukraine. 8,500 troops is not 130,000 troops. I think the reason that we're putting them there is to act as both a tripwire should things flow over from Ukraine into any NATO country, would engage the US in the conflict, so that gives some guarantee of defense to countries like Romania, like Poland, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of which are understandably nervous about what's going on. If you live there, you know that it's proximate, to say the least. So in in terms of us overstepping on this, like the Russians really did do this first. I mean, I don't care what their narrative is. The fact of the matter is the Russians mobilized troops and moved very large amounts of military hardware to the Ukrainian border. And if they don't like us arming Ukraine or having troops in the eastern regions of NATO, they just caused that to happen, right? Their mobilization caused us to start moving stuff into the eastern regions of NATO and to start as quickly as possible building up the Ukrainians' defense capacity. Now, again, think like chess, because Putin is not a stupid person. It in some ways helps him with this narrative that he can, now say, oh my God, the Americans are arming these Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are a bunch of neo-fascist nationalists, and they're suppressing Russian speakers inside Ukraine. And we have to help defend our co-nationals, even if they're across the border. And they have said publicly recently, Lavrov has said, that they will defend Russians no matter where they are. So that kind of language doesn't make me think that we're the basis of this problem, although God knows we've been the basis of plenty other problems in recent world history.
Yeah.
That was a long response, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's right on target, actually. Others want to chime in. We're actually a couple minutes over. I will just, I mean, I don't disagree with what Bill has said. I would say I would caution not to get into the tit for tat type game that all too often becomes part of this buildup that, as Bill, I think very astutely noted earlier, could lead to unforeseen circumstances that might lead us into a water war. Like when we send 8,000 troops over as part of NATO, first of all, that's a fairly minimal number. That's really not going to have any kind of substantial impact. But also on the flip side of that, the Russians just say, oh, look, they're sending troops, right? Which becomes, as you noted, again, Bill, part of their narrative on the flip side. It can work both ways. And I think underlying, and I was going to address this more broadly, but at this point, what is NATO's function in the world? It's a defensive organization that was formed during the Cold War. The Cold War ended a long time ago. And, from the Russian perspective, NATO is the boogeyman, and they've got a point, quite frankly, from that point of view, from their perspective, in my opinion, to address Furkan's original.
By the way, I said wrong. I didn't say, I didn't want to say United Nations, but NATO. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Sorry.
Other final, we have maybe 1 minute and we'll wrap up at 1:05. Final quick comments, anyone? Otherwise, if not, thank you all. And thanks, by the way, especially to Maggie Murphy, who's the wizard behind the scenes, making all of this happen, right? Very much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who was able to attend the event. It was recorded and will be on the, Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it'd be on the UNCG, History Department Facebook page yeah, okay. So if you want to review or spread the word or whatever, it will be accessible there.
On our YouTube channel for the history.
YouTube channel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Nice to see you all.
See you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.